to this installment of the Sustainable Future Seminar Series. I'm Holly Shields. I'm a professor of integrative biology in the Faculty of Medicine, Biology, Medicine, and Health. I'm also the challenge lead for healthy futures within the Sustainable Futures platform. And it's my great pleasure today to welcome you all and to welcome our two speakers who are both from the Global Development Institute and are both going to be sharing talks today about biodiversity and conservation data. So our first speaker is Dr. Johan Oldekop. Sorry, I should have asked you how to say that before. I asked you about your first name, but not your surname. Sorry. He's a senior lecturer in environment and development. And he's going to be speaking today about complex policies for complex landscapes, understanding relative and social environmental conservation and interventions. If you have questions for Johan, please I encourage you to put them into the chat. But actually, at the end of his presentation, we can also have mics and screens turned on, and we can take questions from the floor, or if you'd like. And we'll have 15-minute presentation and 5 minutes of questions, and then we'll move on to our second speaker, who I will introduce then. And just finally, to let everybody know that this session is being recorded, and the recordings will be available on the Sustainable Futures website. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Johan, and we look forward to it.
Great. Thanks. I'm just going to start sharing my screen, and hopefully you will be able to see it. Can you see my screen? Should be able to see the slides.
Yes.
Okay. And you should be able to see my first slide. Yeah? Okay, great. Well, thanks very much for the invitation, and thanks very much for coming here and watching this on a sunny Thursday afternoon. I want to present some of the work that colleagues and I have been doing for a few years now, and some work also that we're currently doing. I want to maybe say just a little bit about myself and introduce myself. So I'm based at the Global Development Institute at the moment, where I'm a senior lecturer. I'm an environmental biologist by training. I did my PhD in what used to be the Faculty of Life Sciences here at the University of Manchester. But I've moved more into the social sciences, and I think most of my work is perhaps now closer to political science, economics, with a little bit of data science kind of mixed in there as well. Most of my work, I guess because I trained as an environmental biologist, is kind of centered around biodiversity conservation and trying to identify what works for people and the environment and why. I think, you know, a kind of guiding thread for my work is very much about how we can make better use of existing data to understand conservation impacts. And it's really great that Rose is presenting straight after me, because I take a quite normative pro-data approach, and I think Rose will be able to balance that with a little bit kind of more critical thinking behind that. And I kind of want to start with kind of stating that conservation is really a kind of crisis discipline. We're now in the process of kind of setting very ambitious conservation agendas to restore an area the size of India when we look at forests, and to double the amount of land under protection by 2030. So going from about 17% of land area currently protected, under protected areas or national parks, to approximately 30. And this increase in protection and this focus on restoration is likely to impact about a quarter of the world's rural population, so over 1 billion people. And I recently saw a talk by Paul Ferraro, who's an economist based at Johns Hopkins, and he's been really fundamental in shaping the way in which we think about evidence in conservation. And In his talk, which you can actually access through the Society of Conservation Biology's website as part of the working group on impact evaluation, he said something really powerful. He kind of said that because conservation is a crisis discipline, the ethos has been to act first and to learn by doing. But conservation is littered with inefficiencies and stories of unsuccessful projects. We continue to lose species. And conservation is also responsible for a whole series of injustices, with protected areas essentially displacing people for conservation. So conservation, it intervenes with endangered species. It affects people's livelihoods, often in economically deprived areas. And we should really be thinking of, changing our ethos from going one of, act first and learn by doing to one which is based around doing no harm. And so therefore, I think, we have this ethical obligation to better understand the impacts of conservation and other, not only just conservation, but other kind of place-based initiatives that are there to safeguard natural resources and the people that depend on these natural resources directly, and to therefore generate a much more robust evidence base. And I think the data revolution essentially can help us that. And colleagues and I have argued that we need to move from conducting small-scale studies at individual points in time and focusing only on individual outcomes to doing evaluations that focus on multiple outcomes simultaneously, looking at multiple drivers and over time. And we really need to do this at scale. And I think data is absolutely essential in trying to help us better understand and to upscale what we've been doing at the moment. And I want to give you a short case study, or present or kind of introduce a short case study of work that we've been doing in Nepal. And this is the part where I thank my co-authors, because this is, of course, not work that I've done on my own. And I've got amazing partners in Nepal, in the US, and also now in Denmark, working on these issues. And Nepal's a very interesting case study, and absolutely crucial to helping us understand the way in which conservation and related policies can play out. So Nepal is a relatively small, landlocked country, kind of north of India, south of China, and it's essentially largely forested, with between 40 to 50% forest cover, depending on what data you're looking at. And it has a very large rural population that depends on forests for much of their livelihoods. So you've got approximately 18,000 community forests, where local communities have been given the management rights to these forests. The country also has a large protected area network. Approximately 20% of the land is under protection. And the tourism industry contributes approximately 7% to the country's GDP. And much of that tourism is actually linked to protected areas and ecotourism. The country's also undergone some really dramatic socioeconomic changes. So according to the 2011 national census, approximately 1/3 of households have somebody who is living abroad and contributing remittances. So this is money that is being sent back. And these remittances contribute to approximately 30% of the country's GDP. And so what you have essentially is a combination of policies and socioeconomic contexts and factors that really have a huge or potential to have a huge impact on the environment and on people's livelihoods and measures of poverty and development in the country. And so one of the things that I'm particularly interested is trying to disentangle some of these relationships, trying to measure and estimate the amount of reductions in deforestation and poverty alleviation that we can link to these different policies and socioeconomic drivers of change in the country. And so we constructed a large data set to look at these issues. And this is the part where the kind of data science aspect kind of links together. So we compiled data on 1.5 million households from the national census to measure poverty over time. We got access to the database on community forests, where we were able to get information on at the time almost all of the community forests in the country, which were 18,000. And combine this with a number of other data sets, largely kind of based around satellite imagery. And just to give you a kind of approximation of scale, so the largest assessment of community forestry until the work that we did was from Lauren Pritchard and colleagues at the International Forestry Resources and Institutions Network that was based at the University of Michigan. And they had looked at 18.4 community forests and published that in Science in 2011. So essentially by trying to compile existing data sets, we were able to increase the resolution with which we could look at some of these issues by more than 2 orders of magnitude. So I think that's a big advance, and I think a good example of how we can use some of these data to look at some of these intractable challenges. So this is a little bit of what the data looks like. So we're able to compile information on poverty, forest cover change, community forests, international migration, protected areas, at the level of individual municipalities, which I've mapped here. And one of the things that we can do with these very large data sets is to essentially select treatment and control units that are much more comparable to each other. And that allows us to almost kind of randomize the treatment assignment and to generate experimental designs that emulate randomized controlled trials. And that's really important because it allows us to really kind of isolate the effect of the individual drivers that we're interested in, and to therefore gain a much more robust estimate of the impacts of these different socioeconomic conditions and policies. So I just want to show you some of the results. So one of the things that we found is that all of these drivers actually reduce deforestation. So this is looking at the average effect. So this is the amount of avoided deforestation that we find in each municipality on average. And we find that, community forests and outmigration reduce deforestation by about 2 hectares per municipality, and the effect of protected areas was much higher. But I think this actually hides something quite important. And so when we scale these results up and look at the effect of these across the country, we find that community forests and outmigration, which are ubiquitous across the country, have actually a much larger effect than protected areas. And I think this actually challenges our assumption somewhat about what kinds of policies can actually lead to changes in deforestation, because we tend to think about protected areas as one of the only mechanisms through which we can actually reduce deforestation. And for poverty, we actually see very similar results in the sense that we find that all of these drivers of change reduce poverty, at least measured through the national census, but that those effects are actually very different from each other when we start looking at how these scale up across the country. Now, one of the things that we can also start to do with these data is to actually look at how some of these policies and socioeconomic drivers actually interact with each other. So what we've done here is to actually look at relative and absolute effects, but we can also start to look at some of these in interactions. And here, I think, outmigration essentially acts as a context within which protected areas and community forests operate. And if you think about community forests as being essentially reliant on human capital, if they're managed by communities, you essentially need a community to be there. You might actually assume that international outmigration might be a way of actually reducing that human and social capital, and might actually reduce the effectiveness of community forests and the way in which they operate. And so that was what what we're currently trying to do, is to better understand the way in which outmigration almost acts as a volume node to the effects that we see with community forests and protected areas. And so I'm going to spend a minute just to explain these graphs. So what we're looking at here, what we're trying to graph, is that relationship between international outmigration and the effect of either community forests in purple or protected areas in blue. And so on the y-axis, you've got that community forestry effect on poverty alleviation and the protected area effect on poverty alleviation. And on the y-axis, you've got a kind of international migration as a scale. So starting from low migration at the bottom to high migration, on the left, to high migration on the right. So as migration increases, the ability of community forests to alleviate poverty actually goes down. And we see the opposite in the case of protected areas. So as international migration increases, the effectiveness of protected areas on poverty reduction increases. So we're seeing international migration essentially operating in opposite effects, or having opposite effects on community forests and protected areas' ability to reduce poverty. In the case of community forests, we think that this might be because migration might be eroding the community forest management institutions that are required for the successful management of community forests. And in the case of protected areas, I think we're hypothesizing that outmigration and remittances might actually allow households to invest in infrastructure that supports tourism, or that allows them to increase the benefits that they get from tourism. So I hope that what I've showed you helps to challenge at least some of our assumptions. I think one of the big things that we can get from using these data is that interventions that have smaller average effects, like community forest management and outmigration, can actually lead to larger effects at scale. And so in this case, they're vastly outperforming protected areas. I've talked about migration as being a driver, and I think it's important to consider when we think about these socioeconomic and ecological contexts, to think of socioeconomic processes being able to have similar effects to policies, but are using data essentially allows us to actually estimate these effects. And also that interventions and socioeconomic processes can interact in idiosyncratic ways. We tend to think about estimating only the effect of protected areas, but why is it that some protected areas work better than others, or why is it that community forest management works better in some areas than in others? And I think these large data sets can help us identify some of these nuances in really important ways. So I'll stop there, just to say that we hope to be able to announce some exciting news that will allow us to continue working on this, and we'll hope to have some postdoctoral and PhD opportunities. So if anybody's interested in learning more, please feel free to email me. And I'll stop there.
Fantastic. Thank you, Johan. That was a really fascinating presentation and certainly has challenged my assumptions on some of these areas. I'd like to open up the questions, and I see one in the chat right now from Stephen Lowe. Maybe we'll start. Would it make Johan, can you read it, or would it make better sense if I read it out? How should we? Why don't I read the first one out, and then we can go from there. So Stephen asks, in terms of community forests, could the reduction be due to a loss of informal forest management by the existing population due to outmigration and loss of traditional skills management techniques?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's an assumption. I think there's some evidence that something similar is happening in Mexico. So Mexico is kind of an analogous case study because it's got this very decentralized forest management programs, as well as high levels of outmigration, at least historically. So it's very possible that's what's happening. I mean, I think that's one of the limitations, perhaps, of using some of these big, large data sets, is that although you can work at large scale, you perhaps miss some of the kind of nuances on the ground. But this is what we think might be happening. Yes.
The next one is, are community forests and protected areas always mutually exclusive?
So not always. I think so. Protected areas tend to be classified in different ways. So you tend to have these kind of very strict protected areas, as well as sustainable use protected areas. They're not always overlapping. I think this is, in this case, when we're looking at the effects of protected areas, we can control for how much community forest management is happening in these areas, and vice versa. In the case of community forest management, we can control for whether protected areas are happening in the same regions. They do tend to overlap, and I think that's why it's really important to kind of think about how these things interact with each other. And that's kind of, I guess what I was trying to do in this, in the second part of that presentation, when we're starting to look at that relationship between community forests, protected areas, and migration, is kind of at least present some of the thinking and some of the initial evidence about trying to disentangle about, how these different drivers interact to shape, what we see on the ground.
In a way that kind of leads on to the question from Gloria, which is, can you share any insights on why migration has these differentiated effects?
So I think that's perhaps related to the first question, and I think what we see there is that community forest management relies on there being a community, and if that community leaves or doesn't have as much human capital, then essentially that community is less effective at being able to manage those forests. They might be able to patrol them less. People are less able to make it to community meetings to be able to make decisions by consensus, because households are stretched in terms of their time allocation. And so if you have that erosion of the human and social capital, then you might see those negative effects. And in the case of protected areas, it might actually be the opposite, right? So households might not necessarily be as dependent on the communities, or on community forest management as a way to improve their household income, and so they're able to use those remittances to invest in some of the infrastructure, right? So if you're a household that is close to a protected area and you have tourists coming in and out, and you also get additional kind of income through remittances, you might decide to invest, let's say, in your tea house to improve the infrastructure and make it more attractive for tourists.
Great. And if I can ask you a question, and I mean, you've given us some great evidence of the value of using evidence in conservation, but what are the challenges to this approach?
So I guess there's two challenges. I think the first one is the first one is the access to social data, socioeconomic data. I think traditionally we've always been much better at monitoring the environment, and we have data from satellite images, coming every hour. When it comes to gaining information about people's livelihoods, that tends to be through household surveys or national census data, which tends to be every few years. In the case of household representative surveys like the World Bank or USAID does, those tend to be every 5 years, but it's not a complete census, they're representative. So there's a disparity in the amount of data that we have available, and the kind of inferences that we can make. So I think that's one big challenge is data availability, particularly socioeconomic data.
And so how do you integrate these different data sets then?
Well, so you try and find a common unit of analysis. So in the case of Nepal, we're able to work at the level of municipalities. In Brazil, where we've also been doing some work, we can also work at the level of municipalities or national kind of census tracts. But when you have representative household data sets that are kind of scattered in space and time, that becomes much more challenging. And there are ways to get around it, but it's not as clean, I guess, as it is with using national census data. But that tends to be much more spaced out in time.
Excellent. So lots of opportunities and challenges for future work to try and bring this together. Thank you. So is there any further questions for Johan? Okay, well, thank you, Johan, for really interesting and stimulating talk and conversation. And maybe I'll move to presenting our second speaker for today. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Rose Pritchard, who is an academic, presidential academic fellow in social environmental systems, also in the Global Development Institute. And she's going to talk to us about just transitions in the datafied world, data justice in biodiversity, conservation, and ecosystem restoration.
Great, thanks very much, Holly. I will just screen share and hope everything's still working all right. There we go. Right, is that showing up okay?
Yes.
Great. So yeah, thank you very much for the introduction and for the opportunity to come and chat to you today. So Johan's just shown a beautiful example of how we can use big data sets in conservation research to try and answer challenging questions. I'm going to take a little bit of a step back and a slightly more critical perspective, and I'm going to try and persuade you firstly that you should care about issues of justice in relation to conservation, restoration, and other kinds of environmental data. And then also talk a bit about the kinds of things we need to think about in terms of data if we really want to use those data to produce kind of conservation strategies that are both ecologically effective, but also socially equitable. So in terms of why we should care about these things, I'd say it's a mix of 4 issues, and Johan's touched on a few of these already. Because the first one is that however well-intentioned they might have been, some of the actions taken in the name of conservation and restoration have been a source of social harm, and in some cases continue to be a source of social harm. Things like displacement, loss of livelihoods, loss of the land and relationships between people and land. And that's become even more important now that we're trying to upscale conservation activities. So with initiatives like the 30 by 30 campaign, where you could potentially have conservation initiatives that are impacting millions of hectares of land and billions of people's lives. And a lot of those impacts are likely to be in countries of the global south where biodiversity is still high, but also levels of social deprivation are quite high. So how you do that sort of upscaling in a way that's kind of going to protect biodiversity or increase biodiversity while minimizing social harms is a really important question that we're facing right now. And at the same time, parallel to this, you've got these trends towards datafication and digitalization of our lives and of the lands that we live in. And my starting point for this is that even though data are often presented as this kind of objective representation of the world, they're never entirely neutral. So even though a data set may be kind of an accurate representation of a particular thing, say a species distribution, the choices we make about which data are worth collecting and which aren't worth collecting, and the decisions we make based on data sets, those are value-driven choices. So coming back to that idea of species distribution, why do we research some species and not others? Why do some species research projects get funded, whereas others really struggle for funding? How have we defined species in the first place? And if we understand the species distribution, how's that going to change conservation practice going forward? What impact is that going to have on the real world? All of these are driven by kind of the interests and the values of the people who have power to collect data and to act on data. And coupled with this, we have this datafication of the world. And by that, I mean that more and more of our lives, more and more of our lands are captured in some kind of data because of these advances in digital devices. And a lot of the work on this has been done in terms of things like social media traces or internet browsing activity, but it's equally true for conservation with things like remote sensing technologies, satellite remote sensing, drones, camera traps, all of these other kinds of sensors. We now live in a world where people are increasingly observed, but because the observers are more distant from the people who are being observed, and because the analytical techniques are becoming so much more complicated, people are much less able to challenge the ways that they're represented through data or to understand the choices that are being made based on those data. And so we see this combination of things, meaning that there is an increased risk of what we'd refer to as conservation data injustices at this moment in time. So situations in which data is contributing to social and environmental harm. And that makes it really fundamental to take a more critical approach to data, to think about what are the circumstances where data is supporting conservation strategies that are working from both social and ecological perspectives. And when is data serving to reinforce inequalities or injustices, or to marginalize particular people or particular ecosystems in new and different ways? And so to try and explore this, we turn to the justice literature. And the justice literature is huge. We couldn't include all of it. So we've used in particular these three strands of existing scholarship. So we drew quite a lot on environmental justice, which is a long-standing field of research and one that's been explored a lot in relation to conservation. And environmental justice has a lot of focus on things like who's recognized as a stakeholder in environmental issues, on these procedural elements, so who has power and voice in decision making, and then finally these distributive components, so who's benefiting and who's paying costs from environmental problems like pollution and from efforts taken to address those problems like conservation and ecosystem restoration. But more recently, we've also seen this developing body of scholarship on data justice, and Lynette Taylor defined this as fairness in the way people are made visible, represented, and treated as a result of their production of digital data. And fundamental ideas here around things like invisibility, who's seen and who is left invisible, disengagement with technology, how much choice do we have about whether or not we're engaging with particular digital technologies, and anti-discrimination. No one should be made vulnerable to harm because of the ways that they're seen through data. And more recently still, we have this movement called environmental data justice. And this arose in the United States in response to attacks by the Trump administration on environmental data. And it's meant to be about kind of challenging what's characterized as the extractive logic of a lot of data collection. The idea that you go to a place, you take data, and then you leave. And those who were observed or captured in those data sets, those most immediately impacted by those data, don't have any control of what happens next. And so environmental data justice advocates really argue for more kind of participatory, more decolonial, more equitable approaches to the ways that we collect and we manage environmental data. So we had this really rich body of existing scholarship to draw on in our work. But up to this point, data justice scholars haven't really thought so much about the kinds of benefits and harms that could come from conservation and from ecosystem restoration. And also they haven't thought so much in terms of justice beyond the human. And obviously thinking about non-human lives it's a fundamental part of conservation practice. It's all about biodiversity and preserving biodiversity. So we use this as our starting point. And because there hasn't been much work on this in the past, what we've tried to do as an initial step is come up with this set of questions that people using data in terms of conservation could use to think through the justice implications of the data sets they work with and the way that they work with them. And we've kind of grouped these into 5 categories, even though they're interacting, but we had to organize them somehow. And that's so data composition, data access, data control, data use and processing, and data consequences. And I'm going to skip through those quickly now in terms of the kinds of issues we need to consider and why we need to consider them. And I'll draw a few examples from forest restoration literature, just because that's the other bit of research I spend my time in, so where I've got the best examples to work with. And so the first thing we look at is this idea of data composition. And this really links back to those ideas of visibility and of recognition that you see in environmental justice and in data justice scholarship. So who or what is made visible through data? What's hidden by data? And are there biases and distortions in the ways that people, places, or species are made visible? And these are questions that have been asked a lot in fields like criminology, for example, but that haven't been asked to the same degree within conservation. And to just take one example of why this kind of thing is important, I'm going to refer to an atlas of forest restoration opportunities that was produced back in 2014 by the World Resources Institute. And this was in the kind of early stages of the large-scale restoration movement. And the idea of this atlas was that it would signpost places where increasing forest cover or increasing tree cover would be a good idea. And this atlas included quite a few places in East and Southern Africa, and it sparked a very concerned response from a group of savanna ecologists and grassland ecologists pointing out that these are ecosystems that do not naturally have high tree cover. And actually in this particular context, if you go into a landscape like the one pictured here, and you plant lots of trees, you're going to have detrimental impacts on both the ecology and on biodiversity and the livelihoods of the people who are going to be living within that system. And so I think this is a really nice example of how the composition of, in this case, a land cover data set, the fact that the way that land cover data set was produced made grasslands and savannas in effect invisible, shows how the choices made in terms of data composition can lead to potentially detrimental impacts when conservation interventions are implemented based on these data. And there's other very good examples about things like skews in biodiversity data and how that can change the distribution of financial resources for conservation in ways detrimental to certain species. So our second and third elements, we've got these elements of data control. And this is all about who funds data collection, who's got power to determine the content of data, and to challenge biases and distortions. So these very procedural aspects about who makes decisions about data and who owns data. And this is inspired in large part by work on Indigenous data sovereignty. So the argument that's been put forward by Indigenous scholars that Indigenous peoples should have control over data that is collected about their lands and about their livelihoods, particularly because data about Indigenous peoples has often been collected without their consent and subsequently used in ways which are disadvantageous to those same peoples. In terms of data access, there's echoes here of the kind of open access movement and trying to make sure that as many people as possible have the right to access data, but it's taking that a bit further into who has the ability to benefit from data. So who's got the technical and the expertise capacities to actually use data to their advantage. And then we've got these questions about data use and processing. So who's actually using a data set once it exists? How are they combining it with other data to produce information products like maps or scientific papers, for example? What kinds of analyses are being done and what sorts of assumptions are being made in those analyses? And to show why this is important, I'm actually going to go back to the paper that started us off on this track and made us think, well, made me anyway, think that this was really important, which was this paper, which was published in Science back in 2019, which was an attempt to quantify global tree restoration potential. Hugely impactful paper, loads of media attention, loads of citations, also elicited the greatest number of comments on a paper by other academics I think I've ever seen in my life. And most of those comments focused in different ways on the assumptions made in the analysis and how those inflated global tree restoration potential to a really worrying degree. And you might think this is part of the kind of normal ebb and flow of the scientific process. You publish a paper, other people highlight flaws, so you amend the paper, and science moves forwards and does better in the future. But this is where this idea of data consequences becomes really important. This idea of who's making what choices based on these information products, and what impacts could that have, for better or for worse, on people and ecosystems. In the case of this paper, because it was so high impact, even before it had been challenged, it was already reinforcing particular narratives about tree planting and about nature-based solutions and about carbon offsetting, which a lot of us are worried will have detracted attention from the idea that addressing climate change means you need these rapid reductions in fossil fuel use. So it's all about the work that that data set or that information product then goes out and does within human socio-political systems, how it's used by different actors, and what that then means in terms of conservation and restoration actions, and the impact that that has on people living in conservation or restoration areas. So that's a super whistle-stop tour, and this is still quite a young area of research. So we have a massive amount that we still want to do. And we've kind of split this into three things in terms of legal frameworks, further research, and then also the kind of pragmatic steps that conservation researchers and practitioners and that others working with environmental data can take in their kind of day-to-day practice. And with the legal and ethical frameworks, it's really a broad question about, are the ones we have at the moment appropriate to this datafied, digitalized world we still find ourselves in? Like, there's a strong feeling that technology runs ahead, and then these kinds of frameworks have to run to catch up. And I think that's where we are at the moment. We're on the running to catch up stage, and how we redesign these frameworks to be fit to where we are is a really fundamental question. I'm a researcher, so of course I'd say we need more research, but I think in this case it's very strongly warranted. There's been some fascinating theoretical writing on this in the last few years, but now it's about building that empirical side. So getting those really detailed case studies that will help us understand how conservation and restoration data are being used, and what impacts that's having in the real world. And then also in terms of those kind of more practical steps that people can take. I think the first step is seeing this as an issue, and a lot of people won't, and that's totally fine. But we think it's an important one. And then thinking about how we adjust our methodologies to take that into account, how we make things more inclusive, how we make things more participatory, to try and head off some of those issues of recognition and ownership. And how perhaps we need a slightly slower scientific practice when it comes to using these kinds of big data. But we're very aware that sometimes runs counter to the incentive structures we face working as academics. And so actually one of the biggest questions we ended up with, and particularly the earlier career colleagues on the paper ended up with, was how do we stay good academic citizens, and how do we remain humble in our engagements with these data when sometimes the structures we're working in don't encourage us to be so. So yeah, that's kind of what I had for today. Thank you. Thanks very much for letting me share this. It's one of the first times we've given it a run out to an audience, so it's a very much appreciated opportunity. Even if you disagree fundamentally, that would still be really interesting to hear. Thanks. Yeah, thanks very much for listening.
Thanks so much, Rose. That was an absolutely fascinating presentation, and brought up some issues that certainly hadn't crossed my mind when we push forward with conservation, thinking about the animals or thinking about biodiversity and then the consequences across these different platforms. It was fascinating and important thing to consider. So I'll open up the floor to questions right now. Pop them in the chat if you have some questions for Rose, and or you can turn on your mics and show your faces and ask her some questions. And while we're waiting for the chat to populate, maybe I'll just start, because you did mention, I mean, open science and open access, and maybe you could kind of expand on the differences between like open data and data justice. How do these differ, and how do we rectify this?
So I think, I mean, open access, like I'm in favor of the open access movement in an awful lot of ways. I think it's been a really great thing from a lot of perspectives, but a lot of that is all about the kind of the right to access data. So a lot of data is now freely available online or by request from authors, but that still means that a relatively limited pool of people actually have an ability to benefit from that data. So just thinking about kind of colleagues that I work with in rural parts of Zimbabwe, they're going to be represented through various data sources, but they can't then use those data to their advantage. So it's about that next step from making data available online in a particular format to thinking about how do we put this in formats that's actually going to have utility to a lot of different people. And I think the other side of it is this idea of harmful visibilities, because open access data is all about making the world more accessible. But this idea of indigenous data sovereignty pushes back against that and says, no, I mean, sometimes we've been made visible in ways that have let people hurt us. So in what situations does open access data actually lead to harm? And I think some of the new, so I mean, there was this, Google recently brought out this layer that you can use in Google Earth Engine, where you can see kind of individual buildings in any country of the world. And any of us who've done any kind of work around informal settlements or displaced peoples, or people who may not want the constructions they're making to be seen by government actors and things like that, it raises really interesting questions about spatial data and how those data are going to be used. So I think, to me, those are the distinctions.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I suppose when you think about the crises, though, of biodiversity that's happening, and if we don't share things quickly, and if we don't move quickly, when's too little too late, when's too much too soon, and how do you make that those balances in these decisions? How do you make decisions with all of these factors to be considered?
Yeah, I mean, I would love to hear other people's thoughts on that, because it's one that a circle I'm still trying to square, if I'm honest. The fact that, I mean, as Johan said, conservation is a crisis discipline in a lot of ways. And like, you don't want to be just dragging your feet doing lots and lots of deliberative process if that means that while you're doing the deliberative process, you've kind of lost all the kakapos or something like that. But I think it's about looking at those wider structures and kind of building the relationships that allow you to do this in an equitable way, where it's not going to hold you back, because you've already got those strong working relationships with people. And actually, people on the ground can often react incredibly fast to these kinds of challenges and have that contextual knowledge, which is really valuable. It's also this kind of, like, people ask us why we should care about justice. And I think there's the two different reasons. There's that moral perspective of we should do no harm. Like, if we can avoid harm, then let's not do it. But there's also that instrumental perspective that we are building some research now that finds that interventions which are seen as just or equitable by the people most immediately affected may have more permanence, that they may last longer in the world. And that may be the argument for it as well, that where you have equity in that sense of ownership, maybe you're going to have more lasting conservation actions. It's an active research area, so I always caveat it when I talk about it, but in some circumstances that seems to work.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've got a couple of points here, mainly just saying thank you very, very much. Thank you for the interesting and thoughtful considerations. How do you think, like, the perfect approach is? What should conservation data look like? What would be the ideal place that we're going?
So I think this is where it gets thorny, and it's why we avoided being prescriptive, because there's no one kind of perfect transcendental justice, or at least I don't believe there is. Like, there's no data utopia that we can aim for. But there are better and worse choices. It's this, I think, an Amartya Sen idea about addressing manifest injustice, and we can do that. And so we've kind of got these broad ideas on paper now, and the goal now is to try and operationalize that, or to develop ways of operationalize that. So we've got some work that we're hoping to do with a couple of conservation agencies around large-scale databases, where we could look at how you'd make it work in that context. We've got a workshop coming up at the FLAIR conference in October, which is a forest livelihoods conference, which is all about thinking about how do you do forest livelihood research in a just way. So, and we're also trying to do some work in the Peak District at the moment, talking to conservation practitioners there about how they're using data and where they're kind of running into issues with that. So, like I said, this is a fresh area of research, and the next step is to make it really useful, like to make information products ourselves that people can actually work with.
Give us a framework of how to be just and to move these mutually exciting areas and important areas together. Fantastic. I mean, you've given us lots to think about, Rose, and so have you, Johan. It's been a really absolutely fascinating session. And before I draw it to a close, I want to just open it back up to the floor and see if there's anybody else who'd like to make a comment about the role of data in conservation and how we can get evidence data and how we can be careful about using our data. Open it to the floor. Okay, then. I think that's it, but hopefully everyone will go away scratching their heads and thinking slightly differently from attending today. So I appreciate the time from you, Johan, and you, Rose, and also for everybody who came to join us. And for those who haven't been able to join us today, we will make sure that this is available for the rest of the community to engage with at a later time. So thank you all, and hope to see you again next time. Bye. Great. Thank you.